house, we are recording. And the link to the recording will go out afterwards to everyone who has registered. And we ask that once the features are restored, that people remain muted while the panelists are speaking and put questions in the chat. And we will also be capturing some notes and do our best to facilitate and manage a respectful environment and discourse, and ask that you help us with that and forgive us in advance if something goes unexpectedly awry. I'm Sue Bookchin, Executive Director of Be the Peace Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to ending gender-based violence as a significant step toward gender intersectional equity and justice. And we do this through projects that address both the roots and consequences of gender-based violence, trying to alter the systemic and social patterns that sustain it, including patriarchy and white supremacy and colonialism and trans and homophobia and xenophobia and all the ways in which we try to other people. We are one partner in this panel series that includes the Transition House Association of Nova Scotia, Second Story Women's Center, the South Shore Sexual Health Center, Harbor House, Transgender Non-Binary Rights Advocacy Nova Scotia, the Immigrant Migrant Women's Association of Halifax, the YWCA, Avalon, and others, and also some local municipal councilors and two colleagues from Toronto Metropolitan University who run Women in the House program with students. That's Peggy Nash and Tracy Rainey. These conversations started with some of our colleagues who were running for or deciding whether to run or re-offer for municipal elections. And they were considering the impact of hateful social media messages and trolls and threats and the rise of some extremist elements in our community, and the having to consider the impact on them and their families and whether they could feel safe on the campaign trail. We started to think about the broader issues about gender diversity and racism, and that comes at both women and Indigenous and Black and transgender and gender diverse people who run for office, both from the public, but also by their colleagues who are elected to government. And things like personal attacks on appearance, and things that are designed to intimidate and diminish respect and stature that men, particularly white men, never have to deal with. And these threats and vitriol dissuade many people from running at all or prompts people to leave politics prematurely. And we know of people like that, certainly in Nova Scotia, which is really a shame because it compromises our democracy. And if we want to have equity in all spheres of leadership and governance and decision-making, one of the first essential steps is representation. And in the arenas that govern so much about our daily lives. So in the midst of these conversations about what we can do to address these unacceptable dynamics, our colleague Leah heard about a new book called Gender-Based Violence in Canadian Politics in the Me Too Era that's edited by Tracy Rainey and her colleague Cheryl Collier. And we read an excerpt about that, and just reading the excerpt made us want to reach out to Tracy, which we did, and she said she would love to be involved in this panel series and brought in her colleague, Peggy Nash, with whom she co-hosts the Women in the House program, and Peggy is a former MP and author of the book, Women Winning Office, An Activist's Guide to Getting Elected. And so they are partners in co-hosting this series. In the first panel, we talked about how did people see this moment? We had just finished municipal elections. We were in the middle of provincial elections. We know that band council elections happen as well. And then, of course, there was the US election where a misogynist, white supremacist convicted felon got the top job in the land. We learned about some things about the history of advocacy movements elsewhere in the world, particularly in the global South, and how that would inform us now, and talked about what we can do in our own spheres to make political arenas more safe and more welcoming for people of all identities. In the second panel, we focused on the Nova Scotia context and the barriers and gaps in representation, the opportunities, and some of the strengths that we have here in Nova Scotia that we can draw on for support, and talked a lot about taking our power back, raising our voices, building relationships, building allyship, and coalitions of support. So in this panel, we're looking at a vision for change. What are the calls to action so that diverse individuals of all identities can equitably and safely run for elected office, and so that our representatives embody the same rich diversity of backgrounds, identities, and experiences that our populations are. I'll just mention that 2 books, GBV and Canadian Politics in the Me Too Era and Women Winning Office, are both available at a 25% discount online. The Gender-Based Violence in Canadian Politics until December 18th, and Women Winning Office until, I guess, midnight tonight. So December 10th is the last day for that. So with that, I will turn it over to Stacy to introduce our illustrious panelists.
Sorry about that. I wasn't able to unmute for a moment there. So I'm Stacy Godso, she, her, and I'm the project and resource coordinator at Be the Peace Institute. That was a great summary. Thanks, Sue. So I have the honor of introducing our panelists and our moderator, whom I'll start with. Katie Rennie has worked in frontline social services since 2016. She holds an honors diploma in social services from Nova Scotia Community College and an honors degree in women's and gender studies from Athabasca University. With a focus on homelessness alleviation and support, Katie has worked with organizations such as the Halifax Drop-In Warming Center, Out of the Cold Community Association, and Mobile Outreach Street Health. Since moving away from frontline support and into an advocacy role, Katie has joined the team at the Transition House Association of Nova Scotia with a focus on women living with and leaving violence. This position has given Katie the opportunity to explore women's issues and the barriers women face in living lives free of violence and abuse. As well, Katie serves as co-chair of Access Now Nova Scotia, advocating for no-cost contraception for all who need it in our province. Violence and women's homelessness are intimately connected, and it is these intersections that are the focus of Katie's recent work. Dr. Rebecca Major is an associate professor of Indigenous governance and NDV research chair in Northern governance at Yukon University, and is a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario with roots through her mother and maternal grandmother, historically connected to the Northwest with modern connections in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Paternally, she also has Mi'kmaq and Acadian ancestry from New Brunswick. Dr. Major holds a PhD in Indigenous public policy, specializing in Indigenous policy change in Canada, and a master's in Indigenous studies focusing on Indigenous land claims from the University of Saskatchewan. She has completed a double honors degree in history and Indigenous studies, specializing in Indigenous governance and politics. Professionally, she serves as a policy analyst for the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, working in environmental and intergovernmental affairs, and held leadership roles as local president and area representative in the Métis Nation. In her previous role at the University of Windsor, She contributed to strategic planning, helped develop an Indigenous Studies minor, led workshops on equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, and published research in these areas. She wrote a chapter in the book that Sue was referencing, Gender-Based Violence in Canadian Politics in the Me Too Era, on this topic. Joanne Hussey is a self-described feminist partisan, currently employed as the Atlantic Regional Negotiator for the Public Service Alliance of Canada. Formerly the Chief of Staff in the Nova Scotia NDP caucus office, Joanne was the NS-NDP candidate for Fairview Clayton Park in the 2017 and 2021 provincial elections, and in 2015 ran for the NDP in the longest federal election in modern history. Over the past 20 years, she has managed a research program on women's unpaid caregiving, the Atlantic Center of Excellence for Women's Health, worked as a policy analyst with the Government of Nova Scotia, engaged in the development of the 2005 Federal Provincial Agreement on Early Learning and Childcare, and authored a report for the Royal Commission on Renewing and Strengthening Our Place in Canada on the Changing Role of Women in Newfoundland and Labrador. Joanne has a master's degree in gender studies and social policy. Elizabeth Smith McCrossin was recently re-elected as MLA for Cumberland North. Raised on a dairy farm in Lyndon, Nova Scotia, Elizabeth's strong work ethic and drive to help others led her to earn a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Dalhousie University and an Executive MBA from St. Mary's University. Elizabeth has worked as a registered nurse and a business owner, using her experiences to shape her advocacy as an MLA. First elected in 2017, she has been a leading voice on maritime collaboration, improving the healthcare system, increasing local food production, justice for victims of sexual assault and family violence, and responsible government. Throughout her time in the legislature, Elizabeth has faced direct harassment, including verbal attacks and intimidation, both in the chamber and outside of it. These actions have been rooted in her principled stands, particularly when she chose to sit as an independent after being ousted from the PC party. The harassment escalated to the point where Elizabeth felt compelled to hire legal assistance to address these attacks and to ensure her rights were protected. Despite these challenges, she continues to fight for a more respectful and accountable political workplace culture. Elizabeth remains committed to championing policies that create opportunities for all Nova Scotians and strengthen our healthcare system and infrastructure. In her spare time, she enjoys music, gardening, spending time with her family, including her 4 children and grandchildren. Dr. Lynn Jones is a community historian, a human rights and labor activist who grew up in Truro, Nova Scotia. Jones became a strong labor activist with Public Service Alliance of Canada, and then became the first person of color to be elected to the executive ranks of the Canadian Labour Congress. Throughout her life, Lynn has been active in the pursuit of justice, working tirelessly for many causes and organizations that seek to eradicate racism, obtain reparations, secure human rights, and achieve fair labor practices. She has been active in the environmental racism and justice movement and helped craft the first environmental racism bill in Canada. In 2016, she was awarded an honorary Doctorate of Humanities degree from Acadia University in Wolfville, followed later by an honorary doctorate from Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. She has recently been awarded the Order of Canada, the highest award for a civilian in the country. So please help me welcome everyone, amazing panelists, and I'll hand it over to Katie, our moderator.
Thank you so much, Stacey, for that introduction. And thank you, Sue, for opening the event. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third and final panel in this important series. As we conclude our discussions, we turn our focus towards building and sustaining a future where every individual, regardless of gender expression, identity, or background, can safely and equitably run for elected office. I would like to take the time to acknowledge that today is the final day of the 16 days of action on gender-based violence, and it's also Human Rights Day. Everyone has the right to live a life free of violence and abuse. Just for some context about Nova Scotia, in 2023 alone, THANS, the Umbrella Association of Violence Against Women organizations in Nova Scotia, provided support to over 4,500 women and children in our province. We know that gender-based violence is an epidemic in our province. It is deeply rooted in all spaces and spheres, including our political ones. So today we delve into the systemic barriers and cultural shifts needed to make a vision a reality. Our panelists will share their insights, stories, and calls to action to eliminate gender-based violence, harassment, and discrimination in Canadian politics. This conversation is not just about addressing the present, it's about shaping a future in which our political spheres reflect the real diversity that defines our society. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's begin. So question 1, we'll begin with Rebecca. How do we get more people engaged in ending violence, especially if they are not experiencing it? Who are the allies that we need to call on? Joanne, you're up next on my screen. Please.
Awesome. Based on my intro, I'm just going to say that I'm excited to say that Lena Hamid is the new NDP MLA for Fairview Clayton Park, and I'm very excited to be able to celebrate that. You know, if my 2 elections had anything to do with that, that's great. I won. I think that I would agree with what Rebecca has just said, that there has to be an element of like show and tell that happens. You know, working in the political system in Nova Scotia for 6 years, working in the legislature, it is a very male space. And I think that people who experience that privilege, it's very easy for the things that some of the rest of us find difficult to be invisible to them. So just even something like, why are the work hours an issue? You know, there's a lot of conversation about the long hours that the legislature in Nova Scotia sits, the fact that there isn't a set schedule of hours. And it's not just about care responsibilities, that's part of it, but it's also about safety of leaving a building at 1 in the morning when you're very, very tired and you have to get yourself home. And even as a staff person in that building, I definitely had some challenging walks to the parking garage in Scotia Square to find my car in the middle of the night. And there were times when there were people following very close behind me who I was very uncomfortable about, and would turn around and find out they were, you know, male MLAs who were also going to their car, but without the same concerns that I had. So I think just explaining those things, which may seem, I think it's easy to think, well, they must know, they must understand. I don't think that they do. And I think, not to trivialize it at all, but the man or bear conversation on social media, if you ask many women if they would prefer to run into a bear or a man that they in the middle of the woods, they'd prefer the bear. And I think that that is telling. And I think just having those conversations is really important. And I think the responsibility here is really needs to fall more squarely on the shoulders of the people who are in that privileged group. You know, it really does have to be a certain amount of responsibility taking of the individuals who have the power to change the situation. And unfortunately, despite the massive progress that we've made in terms of the number of women and gender diverse people elected in Nova Scotia, there have still been more MLAs named John than there have been women. And so there's a responsibility there for that engagement to come from the people who are benefiting from the current system. And as Rebecca said, having those uncomfortable conversations, you are going to feel uncomfortable. This is going to be difficult. And that's the work that you need to do to make things happen.
Lovely, Joanne. Thank you. Dr. Jones, you're up next. Lynn, whichever you prefer.
Lynn's fine.
Lynn. All right.
First of all, welcome everybody. Hello, everyone. I can see my panel. I cannot see all of you out there that are on Zoom, and that's always hard for me. I can't get any kind of facial feedback in terms of what I say, and that's quite bothersome. It's rare that I will start any discussion or talk or whatever that I do without acknowledging from whence I come, which is Africa, because all African people originate in Africa. And I also acknowledge Mother Africa as the beginning of all people. So we're all two African people. And that's really important to me and very telling for me because it talks about the erasure of our history as African people and the not acknowledging of from whence we come. So I make it my business to ensure that whether you hold on to it or not, we all were birthed through Mother Africa. So I say that. I had a little bit of a problem getting my head around these questions, and I still am. And part of it, I think, I'm still trying to unpack it, has to do with this whole issue of violence, because I feel that living as an African person in this society, I am constantly immersed in violence. So it's not something that is going to come today. We're going to get rid of it by doing whatever. It doesn't change. It's violent. And when you talk about even gender-based violence, I get hairs on my back because I look at I can't have things in little pockets. I can't put gender over here and then put racial over here. It's all one package. So I do have difficulty when we make it presumptive that we're talking about gender and then we get the tag-alongs. So I just like to say mine's racial and gender violence that I have to deal with on a daily basis. I'd like to acknowledge too at this point, which we might get into. And by the way, don't feel free to cut me off. I talk sometimes slow, and it takes me a while to get my thoughts out to you, and I am not offended when you say, okay, that's it. I experience, I'm just coming off a very traumatic experience where right now I am exhausted. My body has been practically destroyed, and it only had to do with violence based on my disability in trying to travel these days, a couple of days to New York for the first time traveling in 6 years. And Air Canada was totally unresponsive to issues of people with disabilities. And suffice it to say, I had a direct flight from Halifax to New York, and I never did get to the United Nations meeting I was invited to be a part of because of the gender-based, racial, gender, disability-based violence that I experienced en route. So I'm still coming out of that since just the first of the week. I wanted to say in this whole thing around violence, how do we get people engaged, especially if they're not experiencing it? And I haven't learned that. For all my social justice work, I haven't learned the prescription for that. I was recently involved in some social justice work where I consider it violent in some ways, where I was working with white able-bodied men and having constantly to be, it drives me crazy, in a training mode. Don't do this. Don't treat women like this. Don't treat people of color like that. Getting all of the apologies in the world, and 2 seconds later, we're at it again. The same issue, the same way. And it's not my responsibility to do the training, but if I don't do the training, there's no more violence hurled against me. So in some ways, people, so for me, it's walk in my shoes, I guess, is the answer. If you want to see some of how we deal with that, is to walk in my shoes. I also think that when people aren't experiencing the violence that I'm experiencing, and my good sister Rebecca there talked about her allies standing up front, that is very much a responsibility. It's not, it shouldn't be it should be happening all the time. It shouldn't be a special thing. That's your job, to play that kind of role. But also in playing that kind of role is sometimes those same people don't know themselves that they're perpetuating the violence. So who's going to train them and help them understand? And it happens um, all the time. There's not a time that people that I'm close to, that I don't even know if I like this word allies, but close, that I'm not still. I've been with them for years. We've been working on projects for years. And then out of the blue, I mean, I had a situation just in this last thing where I had to say, I don't like what you did. I found it violent that when they're going to get upset with me, but when I went to tell my story of around the disability issues, and they thought that they should tell my story. That's violent. I can tell my story. I know my story. I don't need you to tell my story. You can support me in in telling that story, but it's my story to tell. I'll stop there because there's so many issues. I have got very much involved in the political aspects and can give you 50 million instances of what it's like in the big P politics of running, and how that violence uh, really comes out there. I was actually the first Black person in Nova Scotia, Black woman, Black person period, I got to think, but at least, no, Black person period, to seek federal office in Nova Scotia. And that was quite something. When I see all the people of color and Black people running today and even obtaining office, it makes me smile, because having been in the forefront of that whole thing, and I want to tell before we go too about a major thing in apology from the NDP that happened as a result 25 years later, for the violence that I incurred 25 years later, an apology from the NDP. I need to tell you about that sometime this evening. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you. Elizabeth, it's your go.
Well, thank you. Can I just get you to read the question again? I apologize.
Absolutely. How do we get more people engaged in ending violence, especially if they are not experiencing it? Who are the allies we need to call on?
Okay. I think we all have a responsibility and to be allies, and I'm sure everyone that's part of this panel today would probably agree with that. I will just say, in politics, there is a certain culture that it's violence, harassment, bullying is just accepted as that's part of politics. And the first step is recognizing when there is harassment, when there is bullying, when there is violence, and speaking it and calling it out for what it is, not ignoring it, not making excuses that it's, quote, just politics, and acknowledge the wrongdoing. And I've always been pretty good at doing that if I'm there supporting other people. But in my experience as MLA, unfortunately, I've been quote the victim, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to speak up. And I want to share just an example of now I know Liz LeClaire is on here and she witnessed a lot of it, but I guess it was about 3 years ago. There was very direct, very blatant harassment and bullying of myself inside the legislature. Everyone saw it, and I just tried to ignore it. You know, I would just try to stuff the emotion, suck it up. And Kelly Regan, an MLA who just recently retired, she actually took a stand for me and did what we call a point of privilege in the legislature to say this happened to a colleague, to Elizabeth, this is wrong. And then other people took a stand. And sometimes it just takes that one person to sort of be the light and to call it out for what it is, and then it gives other people the courage to say, no, you're right, that's wrong. But there, in politics, my experience is there's a lot of times when you may take a stand and say it's wrong, and there may be no one that will follow you. But it's better to take the risk, be courageous, be brave, and stand up for what is right for people. And I think that is honestly the first step. We know that in other areas outside of politics, so why should it be any different inside of our political world? It's the same. We're not, in order to create the change, we need to talk about it. We need to call it out when we see it. And I believe it can change. It's not easy. It's not going to change quickly, but we need to unite, I believe, here in Nova Scotia, but really across Canada, and just say, this is wrong. This is not acceptable. And I do think political parties, there's such a centralization of power, and there's a fear in caucuses that if you say anything, you're going to be punished. And the reality is that does happen. But I just was elected for the second time as an independent. And so I'm hoping that will inspire the other MLAs to see that it's okay to stand up and do what is right for your people you represent, for your colleagues, to speak the truth, and that there's a good chance your constituents will continue to support you if you do what is right. Because I do believe in politics, the reason that people stay silent is because there's a fear of punishment, and that they're going to lose their job, or they won't be supported by their constituents. And I guess I'm an example that isn't always the case. So I'll leave it at that and open it up for see what the next question is.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Moving on, question 2. How do we re-engage people who have been turned away due to violence? Joanne, you're next.
Yeah, I feel that. I think I have often been in a position where I'm talking to people who are interested in getting involved or running, and I think we have to be really honest about the risks that we're asking them to take. Like, I think we have to be really, really open and honest about what it will mean for them as individuals and their lives and their families. And, you know, self-care is not a replacement for systemic change, right? Like, you can't self-care your way out of a really horrible, violent, harmful situation. And that's not to say that that is going to be the entirety of their experience, but you know that will be a portion of their experience. And I think that there has been, particularly in politics, and I think in other fields that have been typically dominated by wealthy white men, that for those of us who are not wealthy white men who are going into those spaces, there has been this kind of get along to get by approach that people have felt that they've had to take. And then that turns into an environment where people who you might think would be allies have an attitude that, well, it was hard for me, but I did it, so you can do it also. Or, you know, it's not going to be easier for you. It wasn't easy for me. And I think that that's not good enough. It's not okay. I think we have to figure out how to occupy those spaces differently. And I don't think that we can expect people to make that choice to take on those roles unless you can demonstrate that there has been a material difference made. You know, again, I don't think that in my time in the NDP caucus office, I would not argue that, you know, we changed the world and that everything was totally different. However, I do know that when I worked there, almost all of the staff were women. And that definitely made a difference for me, because there was a shared understanding of some of the things that we were, some of the experiences that we were having. And I think that we need more people in those spaces who are taking on that role of being supporters of people who are coming through behind them, and who are willing to use their privilege in that way to say, I have privilege in this space that you don't have, and therefore, like, come after me. Like, I can I can take it, and then you don't have to. And offering to support those folks who are willing to take on those difficult roles, because it's a very difficult role, I think, to take on when you don't have the, as you said, the wealth and the privilege, and you don't occupy the space in the same way.
Lynn?
I think maybe Elizabeth struck the nail on the head, and that was to acknowledge the violence, because so often things happen, and we're, like you said, you're out there alone, and nobody supports, nobody acknowledges, and sometimes you might not even understand it. But acknowledge when somebody tells you they have experience in that role. It's kind of like if I tell you that this was a racist act and you come back to me and say, I don't think so. Like, excuse me, but I think I got a little bit of experience in that area. So acknowledge that and come along with me to say that, yes, it was racist. Now you can, okay, I hear you, Lynn. I'm now listening, because that is one of the greatest things that does not happen, is people don't listen and they don't acknowledge us who have the experience, whether it be women, racialized women, to say of what has happened. So it's really, really important. I also think that there needs to be, we talk about space, but we need to leave space for these women to create and to bring their experience to this table that we may not understand, may not have been involved in. And the space has to be, what's the sense in doing the same thing? What is that saying over and over and getting the same results or whatever? What's the sense in bringing them back if there hasn't been any changes that have been made? And part of that is changing that space and leaving space for that person and that person's culture. I remember somebody once was telling me they went to a particular church because they had joined the choir, and people thought, oh, it's really great. Everybody sings this music. This is the choir music. And this particular minister recognized that he wasn't keeping a diverse culture even within the church. And one of the ways he changed it was he allowed those new people to come in to bring their music into the choir. And it changed the whole way that the choir conducted, and it also changed the makeup of the whole church. and who came to church and who didn't, just by allowing space for that culture and that music within that forum. I found in the union movement, one of the biggest faux pas was that they didn't acknowledge the experience that people brought to the table that weren't trade union traditionally. They couldn't get in the trade union due to the violence against women or the violence against race. And when they did try to get in, their experience in the community was never given any credibility and culture. And they may have had more experience and background that would have been required. So the union missed out, the trade union missed out on having all these people's involvement because they didn't acknowledge their community experience and or their experience in the women's with women. We used to teach this course about is baking cookies political, and people say, oh, of course, how can baking be political? But women, a lot of women bake and they bake cookies, and we learn the political aspects and what skills women brought to the table because of doing different recipes and mixing different things, getting people to cook and what have you. So that was a case of when we start understanding that when they brought those skills from the kitchen into an environment, that they were more likely to come into this, come back to this environment. Issues that you've all heard before that seem so elementary, but yet they play out so much even today. If you've been trained, for example, not to be assertive or not to be valued, and then you go into a culture of where people, men, white, able-bodied, they're assertive, that's part of their cult, that's what they do, and you're not, then you don't survive and you leave because you don't know how to operate. You don't know the rules. You don't know Robert's Rules of Order or Borneo Rules of Order or whatever. So you got to teach people the rules. I'm just doing a simple thing, not simple, trying to build affordable housing in the community and using community people to do it. And I said, like, we've got to bring in other people. We can't just get community people because we've been left out of the game. What do we know about building, these fancy things, like, these affordable? We got to bring people in who have been doing it all along and know the rules, but we're going to learn those rules and but it's also part of, if you're going to bring me into wanting communities, which all of a sudden they say, oh, NGOs can build affordable housing. Well, if you've never done it before, what do you expect? You've gotta learn and be trained by people who have been along. When it comes to women, we leave out the money all the time. Somehow or the other, we're supposed to operate without money or financial resources. If they're coming back and you want them back, you got to look at the finance part of it. I'm in this small community of Toronto, and people were working with single parents, poor single parents, and the question was asked, what's the most resource these women, single women, they weren't parents, single women, what do you need more than anything to do some community stuff and what have you? And they said taxi chits. We would never in a million years have thought the taxi chits was the barrier, just the main barrier as they identified it for participation, many others, but taxi chits? Yeah, because there's no transportation. We've got to get our kids here. We've got to get them there. Then you expect us to come home, make it to the meeting. We can't afford to get to that meeting. And again, listening and something so simple. So I'll stop, but just to say that we don't listen. And If we listened and asked questions of the people that we want to re-engage, the answer's with them, not with us. But if we don't listen, we don't hear what the answer is.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Thank you. So, re-engaging people that have been turned away by violence. The other panelists had a lot of great comments and feedback, and I was thinking about my personal experience with this in politics. And unfortunately, I've witnessed uh, some other women directly be destroyed, or at least attempt to destroy them. And I've seen it step by step. I've seen the very specific maneuvers and strategies done to take them out, to try and remove them. And I have two women in particular that I stay in very close contact with, and their lives are changed forever. They will never re-enter political life, at least not in the same way that they were. And what I try to do just as a friend is I try to stay engaged. I reach out to them, try to find ways to support them, reinforce that they did nothing wrong, that they simply were harmed, and the people that found ways to remove them and cause harm to them simply were threatened by them and did not want them, in particular, women, strong women in both cases, intelligent, strong women. They did not want them in any way to be in a position where they had power. And it's really hard seeing people be harmed and see their lives be destroyed. So re-engaging them, I think it's just really important, is meeting them where they're at, supporting them, reaching out, and finding out what do they want. On the flip side, when I've been in the position of when they were trying to destroy me, I guess I'll just share with you, never underestimate the power of being that person who does support. So I had a woman who was a lawyer. Actually, a family friend said, "Hey, you need to talk to so-and-so." So I texted her, and she said, "Hey," it was like 11 o'clock at night. She said, "Are you free right now?" And I said, "Yes." And we talked for 2 hours that night. And she just said, "This is not right. You need to call it out for what it is. You need to lay out the pattern. You need to speak your truth and lay out the pattern. And then as they continue, if they choose to continue to try and harass them, it will be very clear to everyone that's watching because you've connected the dots." And so I did that. But I can tell you, I would not have had the courage to do that. I don't think I would have, if I had not have been encouraged by, in particular, this one woman, but others as well. So I think it's just never underestimate the importance of each one of us supporting each other, and encouraging people to speak their truth. And when something is being done wrong, to be that light and to call out the darkness. I mean, there's people on this panel, there's people watching here tonight that you're trying to change. You're trying to create change in a system that does not want to be changed. People want to hold on to that power, and they don't want to lose it, what they perceive as power anyway. And the reality is, none of us are going to be able to make any significant change without them trying to destroy us. That's just a reality, I believe. And so there's a strong power dynamic. And if we're going to be in these positions of trying to create change and systemic change, we have to find ways to keep ourselves strong and to strengthen each other and to empower one another through this very tumultuous time. And the last comment that I will make is, one of the other panelists mentioned, that financial barriers, not having the ability to hire a lawyer, those kinds of things can be a real challenge for women. And I had the gift of, I had some lawyers reach out to me and actually offer me their services pro bono. And in fact, the most recent legal battle that I faced, I had a lawyer who was a former NDP, Joanne, Kevin, oh my gosh, I'm just blanking on his last name, but Kevin DeVoe. So he served as an MLA for 9 or 10 years. He now is doing legal work through the United Nations, strengthening parliamentary democracy around the world. And the latest thing where I hired lawyers and had him actually work for me as well is they tried to remove me. They actually put forth a notice of motion. It was a woman, it was a female MLA, put forth a motion to actually have me removed, even though I had been duly elected, because they didn't like, I was challenging. I put forth a bill around NDA use by political parties. And because I know of a situation, that's for a larger conversation, but they didn't like it because I was shining a light on something very dark that they were trying to hide. So they tried to actually remove me. And this Kevin DeVoe contacted me from Sri Lanka and said, what is happening in Nova Scotia? What they're doing to try and remove you is so anti-democratic. It's so unconstitutional. And I will help you. And when he came back to Nova Scotia from Sri Lanka, we had a coffee and he helped me for a year and a half. And I had 2 other lawyers as well. So anyway, I'll end there, but never underestimate the power that we have just helping and supporting one another and sharing what we have, our talents and gifts with one another.
Lovely, Elizabeth. Thank you. Our third and final question. What are your calls to action to eliminate violence, harassment, and discrimination in Canadian politics? Joanne.
I love that I'm not the only one who loves a good policy. Love a good piece of legislation, love a good policy. Yeah, I think idealistically, I would say, we need to elect more progressive feminists who understand structural barriers and are brave enough to try to deal with them, and not get attached to that idea of power, however fleeting it may or may not be. I think Rebecca was saying that a lot of the people that we know and that we talk to who want to get involved for these reasons. They want to create those changes. They want to see an improvement. And I think when we talking about structural barriers, my favorite example that I think is just so basic from, again, the Nova Scotia legislature context is that when Alexa McDonough was elected, there wasn't a women's washroom for elected people. So they had to put one in because there wasn't a bathroom there. So that's a very small scale structural barrier. But the first change table in Province House was only added 2 years ago when Kendra Coombs had her baby. So the fact that there wasn't until 2 years ago anyone who thought we should have a change table in the provincial legislature is stunning. But that's kind of one of the very small things that you just need to start dealing with. And I think potentially unpopular opinion, but probably not with this group. There have to be actual consequences for men's bad behavior.
Yes.
I think we hear a lot about, how, men's lives are ruined, but they're really not. That's the problem. Perhaps ruining more men's lives is the answer. I think Brad Jones was the Minister of Justice and said that domestic violence wasn't a problem in Nova Scotia and got reelected. Kylie Harris, assaulted his then partner and continued to be gainfully employed in the Liberal caucus office for many years and is now still a public-facing person working with Shelter Nova Scotia. So I think that that's a real problem. And I'm not saying that there's no ability to be redeemed. But I am saying that there's chance that these are not the appropriate people to be the faces of our institutions, especially when those institutions intersect with people who are vulnerable for a lot of different reasons. Um, I think also, you know, the other part of this is about community and supporting each other and having those uncomfortable conversations at work and with your neighbor and with your friends and with your kids to try and increase that understanding of what is and is not acceptable behavior. Um, and talking to people who are elected to tell them what is and what is not acceptable behavior. Um, and never underestimating the power of people screaming in the street, right? Like the MLAs in the legislature will only talk about or only go as far as the public will kind of let them. And if there are people calling them, emailing them, screaming in the street with signs, like that sets the tone, that sets the direction. And so I think, anytime that you can do that is as important, I think, as any time that you are going to take any other political step in your life.
I love a good scream session in the streets, as you know.
Yeah.
Lynn, please take it away.
I have a few things in terms of how we're going to eliminate this violence and in the Canadian and moving it into Canadian politics. So I have the standard kind of methods that still are good, and we need to institute them, put them into action, which is, of course, using our legal systems, our courts, and what have you. We're not going to throw those out with the bathwater. Like, we need to challenge our legislation. Political action. Never again. It's I hope always going to be there, and that we're going to be on the streets, as you say. I used to have in the early 80s, late 70s, we had a whole team of people, and we called ourselves Renademo. So anytime there was any need to protest or whatever, it took. I mean, in those days you didn't have computers and things, and it just took a phone call, and we had our little system in place, and our whole team of demonstrators were on the streets ready to roll. And we see some of us see each other, and we still use that terminology, rent a demo. And we had some good games in those days as a part of our demonstrations. Um, so it's those traditional kinds of things that we're all well aware of. Let's not leave them off the table, because they still need to be there. But I started out this talk, and this is the last question that we have tonight on the 3-question thing here. And I go back to, we have a saying too in the Black community that says, "Ain't I a woman?" When you talk about women, it's usually not our issues that you're dealing with. And so Sojourner Truth has great speech on, as Black women, "Ain't I a woman?" And my issue's important. So some of the things and I include Aboriginal women because we have been in together on some of these issues. And one of the things, particularly in Canada, is, first of all, to declare racism as a crime. It's never been a crime. It's not a crime. And so you can continue to harass us, hurl violence against us, and never spend a day in jail, kind of like the president you talked about across the border, because it's not a crime to be racist. So we keep experiencing this violence over and over and over and over again. And by law in Canada, just to say that we've been racially profiled, racially attacked, or whatever, it's not a crime. So we can't even use the legal system to do something about it. So one of the ways is to make racism a crime. What goes along with that crime is reparations. Is that you owe us. You've done these things to us for centuries, generations, and it's advanced your cause, not ours. And it's meant that we haven't been able to make the gains that we should have been able to make, whether it be in the education system, political system, any system that you can possibly name. And so as a result of that, there is a responsibility to pay reparations to the women and and others as a result of this violence. I started out too saying I wanted to flag the NDP. I won't get into the violence that was hurled against me in the party, one instant in particular when I ran for the first time and was able to declare at that time, it was a big thing, I was the 100th woman candidate for the party in the whole country, the 100th woman. And so there was going to be great celebrations. And the national leader and everybody coming to town because it was expected that the woman in Halifax West would be running in Halifax West, would be the 100th woman to be running. But in actual fact, it ended up that I was the 100th woman who had gained the nomination the night before. But rather than, and it wasn't expected, so rather than change the agenda, the party went ahead and let the woman in Halifax West be declared the 100th woman, knowing very well she was not the 100th woman. So 25 years went by, and that was never addressed. But it still was in my mind, because I had to, at the time, say, let it go, continue running, see what, can't stop. I mean, and the leader of the party, Jagme, came to Halifax to do the 25-year later, excuse me, apology, which I didn't really want, didn't care. But I wanted to, just wait, I'm gonna have a drink of water here. Excuse me. The deal was that in accepting this apology, I wanted one thing. And that was that the party become the leader in terms of being in the vanguard of requesting reparations for African and Aboriginal people. So the party was to be the leader of all other parties to try to get the government to agree to reparations or to acknowledge that we required reparations. To my knowledge, it's been how many years later? 10 years later? It was never done. So here we go that I had this violence that was hurled against me. In 25 years, get an apology and a commitment, which is in writing, to deal with the reparations issue, and how many, another 10 years later, whatever, and we haven't done a thing about it. You're going to be surprised, so I'll leave that. Excuse me, and add another, which you're going to probably be surprised. And that is employment equity legislation. I think it's really important. The problem is not the legislation. The legislation is good. And there's been some recent changes, which are good. The problem is the instituting of the legislation. So if we're going to change things, we've got it right there in the employment equity legislations, but nobody's ever had to be accountable to meet the goals and the timetables of the employment equity legislation. But had we had something in place, and as you know, that's one of Trump's first things is to get rid of the affirmative action legislation, because he knows it's good. And he knows that it will change, which is what we're seeking here in this question. So what do we do? First thing is try get rid of it. I have another list of things, but I only want to say one because of time, because I keep seeing in this chat the NDA's issue arising. I actually have a non-disclosure on me. from the union, PSAC. It has to do with the fact that I dared challenge the union for about their sexism and their racism. Same thing, same issues that we're talking about. It went through all the union channels it could possibly go through, the human rights channels. Still, we didn't get justice. We went to the courts, ended up in the Federal Court of Canada. And without going into a long talk, I believe that we could have won it in the Supreme Court, but we had to end up dropping it at a level and hoping to get to the Supreme Court, but the union wouldn't agree. And so we had to sign a non-disclosure agreement about the group of us who challenged the racism, sexism, and ableism in the Public Service Alliance of Canada. As we speak, I saved every document, every piece of paper, every thing from the membership, and there is presently, and it's in the Lynn Jones Diaspora Heritage Collection at the university, which is open to the public. And a person, as we speak, is writing this story of how, because that case was never properly settled, in his view, that the union cannot progress because they haven't dealt with the sexism and the whatever from that period. And that's a non-disclosure agreement that I myself had to sign, or I would have lost host, home, everything else. That was what came at the end of the story, I guess. But the story's not over. So that's it for me.
And Elizabeth, please. Oh, Elizabeth, it's your go.
Yes, sorry about that. It's
Sorry.
really interesting listening to the other panelists. Thank you all for sharing. So calls to action to end harassment in Canadian politics. It's a big one. And I'd say it's just really important that each and every one of us continue to be fearless in our actions to end harassment, to stand up for one another, to call it out when we see it, to acknowledge it, and realize that no matter how strong you think someone is, that we're all human. I consider myself a very strong woman, but when I am at the center of the harassment, I need other people to support me. And I think each and every one of us need that. And there was an experience that I had, we've talked a lot about men, but I'm here to tell you a lot of the harassment that I have experienced and bullying and violence as an MLA has been at the hands of other women, not just men. And whether or not it's got to do with, Rebecca, you talked a lot about ego, which I agree. There's a lot of power and ego in politics. I'm not really sure what the driving motivation was for the women, but having other people, whether it's women or men, stand up for us and acknowledging harassment and violence in the workplace, in the political workplace, when it happens, really, I believe is what is needed first in order to create change. Some of my friends in the chat are asking about NDAs. There's no question, in my opinion, that legislation needs to change around the use of non-disclosure agreements, especially in the cases of the misuse around sexual assault and violence. One of the bills that I tabled, which was really a bill to support the work of a bill that the NDP caucus had tabled around changing the misuse of NDAs in cases of sexual assault. I tabled a similar bill, but it was more specific, and it was to end the use of NDAs around the misuse of sexual harassment, violence, battery, specifically in legislatures, in Canadian legislatures and political parties. And some of you listening may know, I had an employee that worked for me. She is now passed. She passed away very tragically. She had a cerebral hemorrhage, but she herself was a victim. She worked for a political party here in Nova Scotia. She went through sexual harassment or violence battery. She was cast aside, those were the words of her parents, by the party that she was with, and really suffered alone, suffered in silence. And when I became an independent, someone suggested that I hire her. I needed to hire a legislative assistant, and she came to work for me. And I learned through her what she went through. And tragically, I got to see firsthand the effects on someone's life, whether inside or outside of politics, how the damage that it does to people. And I am committed, I'm very resolved to continue the fight for her in honor of her life, but for other women too, to get legislation changed so that no one else is treated the way that she was treated. And in my political fight and legal battle against the notice of motion to have me removed, which, by the way, was all because I tried to shine a light on this. There was, her parents tabled the NDAs that she had to sign, and they're all within the courts, and the documents are still sealed. And the reality is, media don't want to report on it because everyone's scared of being sued. And we need to change this. We need to, so absolutely, thank you, Liz, and others for bringing that up in the group chat. NDA legislation is definitely one of the things that will help us to end the harassment and the control here in Canadian politics, and especially around sexual harassment. But I mean, the reality is there is definitely a power dynamic. And I know many other women that worked as staff within political parties that suffered, that were victims of sexual harassment and violence, and they've never spoken up. And they don't want, for whatever reason, that's their choice. But we need to change that culture. We need to change that culture in Canadian politics. And the only way to do it is to speak the truth, be brave. And, you know, a word that I use a lot is to be fearless. And what do we have to fear anyway? I don't think we have anything to fear. Like, who can hurt me? I'm just speaking the truth. And do whatever you want to try to hurt me. You can't hurt me. Because I believe when your foundation is truth and standing up for justice for other people, you can try and fire me, you can do all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, I know what I'm doing is standing up for what is right. And I believe when we unite and do that, when all of us do that, really no one's going to be able to stop us. So I just think the way to end harassment in Canadian politics is to speak the truth about it and stand together, united in our action to end it.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We have a lot of talk in the chats about NDAs, so I wanted to give Rebecca and Joanne each a chance to, you know, respond to some of those questions surrounding NDAs. I'm happy to read some of them, but they're in the chat.
I haven't had it come up in the collective agreement context yet. I think it's an interesting question because a lot of the collective agreements that I work with do have a lot of language around process for dealing with harassment and discrimination in the workplace, but without any specific mention of NDAs. But I think that that's something absolutely that will probably become more of a bargaining issue as more people start to understand what it means for them or what it could mean for them. You know, I think my personal opinion is absolutely that there should not be the legal ability to use an NDA to shield people from the consequences of their own bad behavior. You know, I think that we've seen in the Nova Scotia context, and I'm sure everywhere, lots of examples of NDAs being used And the consequence of that is that people just end up enduring the same thing. New people keep enduring the same bad behavior from the same individuals over and over again because there was no ability for them to be warned or for there to be an understanding of what the situation was like. So that absolutely needs to be addressed. There's no question.
Can I respond, even though I talked about NDAs?
Please, Lynn, go ahead.
In my case within the unions, it's so unfair. For example, you pay your union dues, yet when you have a case of sexual, racial, whatever harassment, you cannot use the money that you paid into your dues to represent yourself. You have no finances. Yet the union does. They use that money that you paid into for your dues to challenge you. So you have absolutely no money from, and this is how the system worked. So you had to depend on the good naturedness of the other members of throwing in money to help you to try to challenge this whole thing. And I was lucky at the time I had a brother that was a lawyer who did work pro bono. The other thing that I learned in the process, also in this case, is the role of the Human Rights Commission, who wanted basically nothing to do with the case, even though the union made said, you can't deal with us until you go through the Human Rights Commission first. And the Human Rights Commission says, we don't want it. It's too tough for us. Go back to the courts. So you had this football. But as this author is writing the whole case, it's really, all these years later, it's affirming in the sense that as he looks at the systemic issues that come up against women and people of color in those systems, his conclusion, and he's a professor that's in labor, whatever, so he knows labor legislation and what have you, and he said, do you know, you couldn't possibly have won. Like, you were fighting a battle that you couldn't possibly win because the systems were such, they're set up so you can't win. You would have to change the whole system in order for you to have won. So the perpetrator got to live out their life within the trade union in their position, and all of us are gone because we're not sticking after every other level said the person was guilty. So I just like to say these powerful systems, it's like this corporate cultural change we talk about. If we don't get at that change, we can fight all we want with these non-disclosure agreements, but we're not going to get anywhere until we change it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynn. Another repeating theme in the chat is economic violence, both financial barriers for many to run and or legal burdens for the protection after an incident. So we're talking about leveraging the largest transfer of wealth to women specifically, to use that to support a more diverse representation. Does anyone want to speak to that? Joanne, go ahead.
I can at least start. Yeah, I think that is a huge part of asking women to get involved in political life, is understanding that the financial lives of women are different. And again, the financial lives of racialized disabled women are going to be different. New immigrant women, Virgin women, all going to be very different in their own and complicated in their own ways, and that there needs to be financial support there. It's not just about moral support and volunteer hours. It's about the fact that Often for women to get involved in political life involves, and this is gross but real, involves clothing purchases, involves, more frequent haircuts, involves funding for childcare that men somehow don't need. It's really weird. And I think that there's generally a lack of understanding of those basic things. I worked for Gary Burrell for many years. And for those of you who don't know who Gary Burrell is, he was the leader of the Nova Scotia NDP for the period of time that I worked there. And he is, a regular middle-aged man who was a United Church minister. Gary could wear the same shirt every day for a week and no one would notice. But if one of the female members of our caucus showed up wearing the same blazer 2 days in a row, oh, there would be a lot of conversation about that. And so I think that recognition at the beginning is important. And then it is going to continue to be a difficulty. Again, in Nova Scotia, the MLA salary has not increased since I think the mid 90s. And while it's not popular to talk about how much MLAs get paid because they're universally kind of hated. But the reality is, if you're going to ask somebody to put that much time and energy and effort into something that is precarious, like most of women's employment, it really needs to pay enough that you are not taking a financial hit to take that job. And I think, again, women feel that more than men do because they are going to generally be earning less in their lifetimes. So I think that there's a whole bunch of structural things that relate to the financial inequity of women in entry to politics, and then in dealing with any of the things that come up through that involvement. That really do need to be appreciated and understood in a different way. The current, not the current government, but the current government, when it was the previous government in Nova Scotia, had the opportunity to address some of those things in terms of MLA pay and in terms of childcare costs, and chose not to because it was politically unpopular. And so I think recognizing that is really important.
Thank you, Joanne. Elizabeth or Lynn, do you want to speak to the economic side of things?
Go ahead, Lynn.
I think Lynn wants to pass on this one. Elizabeth, did you have anything you wanted to throw in there?
Yeah, sure. So I apologize. I had someone knocking at my door. Can you just repeat the question?
Sure. So it's economic violence, both financial barriers for many to run and or the legal burdens for protection after an incident. So leveraging the largest transfer of wealth to women specifically to use that to support more diverse representation.
That's a big question. And one of the things I thought a lot about as I'm listening tonight is, maybe there is a need for us to create a fund to support women. That may be something that we can look at. Like I know there's a fund, there's a group nationally like to help pay for legal fees if there's challenges to the Constitution. I don't know. Maybe there's an opportunity there for us to create a fund to help women in these challenges. Like I will say, I have no problem going to seek legal advice, and I've hired a lawyer about 7 times because I'm not putting up with stuff. And so I've been challenging along the way since I was first elected in 2017. Sometimes my husband says, are you actually ever going to make any money in this job? Because I paid out so much in legal fees. But I know that not everybody has that ability. I do think, any chance women have an opportunity to find other women that can support them financially, that we should never be afraid to ask for help. And I've been in my situation. One of the reasons that I guess one of the things that's really helped me is I had a woman who was a former banker, and she's been basically my fundraiser for when I went in a leadership race, for all my campaigns, and she knows where the money is and she finds it. And that's been a big thing. So I've been very blessed with all my campaigns, even as independent twice, that I never, I was very blessed with having good financial backing, but it's because I had people out there doing that work for me that were willing to do that. So, but it certainly can be a challenge for sure. I think it's important to recognize that. But we do have, I guess, there's money out there. So I don't think as women we should ever say it can't be done, because we've just got to find ways to leverage that money and support one another financially too whenever we can as well, I think.
I think it would be important to talk at this stage too about the Court Challenges program that allowed more women to challenge the systems. I forget what the statistics are, but it'd be worth even afterwards of how many women challenged the system when the program was in place compared to when the party got rid of the Court Challenges program. So women have really real economic barriers to challenging any system. So and it does take money, and you talk about some people just don't have the resources to hire lawyers and things like that. So that's refers to the other question that we had earlier, is that reinstatement of the Court Challenges program would very much change the trajectory in terms of women's involvements and abilities.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I do have one last thing I wanted to bring forward. This one's for Tracy Rainey. Can you, in 4 minutes or less, because we are almost at 8 o'clock, could you discuss the calls to action that emerged from the findings in your research that you believe could be enacted in Canada to address this issue?
Am I unmuted? I just had a little.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
You're
Thank
good.
you. First, I just want to say what an incredible panel this has been. When Cheryl and I co-wrote the introduction to the book, I wish that we had attended this panel first, because I've learned so much from each of you. And I think, it's really important that, as the panelists have said, that we give space to these issues, that we listen to each other, that we support each other. And at the same time, I think it's also important that we have hope. And that's difficult to do. And I acknowledge that. And I think sometimes I remind myself that the reason why violence is happening and that this backlash is taking place is because some change has happened, or because change is being attempted. And so I know it's sort of a small glimmer of hope, but it is one that I think about when I listen to all of you talk tonight. So in the book, Cheryl and I ask each of our authors to provide calls to action. So their research lays out different problems and different issues around violence and harassment in Canadian politics. And then each of them, arising from their research, discusses these different calls to action. And that was sort of very deliberate on our part to try to have the book be more hopeful. And so I'll tease out a few of these. So the first is that it's important for us to, I think, recognize, and this is hopeful, that there's a lot of work being done globally and internationally to address these problems. So I'm thinking, for example, in the United States about the National Democratic Institute, which has the Not the Cost campaign. And then there's also a toolkit that the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation Europe, has developed for the Democratic Institutions and Human Rights Office. And what they've done is develop these 4 toolkits, and I'll put the link for it in the chat in just a moment, that's directed at parliamentarians and political parties and civil society organizations. And just to kind of tease a couple of these points out. So the first point is that there's an acknowledgement, as was discussed by all the panelists tonight, that the institutions themselves need to be changed. That we can't just say we've got to solve violence and harassment as an independent solution to the fact that the institutions themselves need to be changed. That the settler, colonial, misogynistic underpinnings need to be unsettled of these institutions. And there is a pathway forward for that. So there's a global dialogue and discussion on how to diversify or diversity sensitize parliament. So for example, the Interparliamentary Union, which is an international organization, has developed metrics that parliamentarians can apply to their own parliaments. And so this requires then not just us addressing violence and harassment in politics, but a much more comprehensive response that gets into these underpinnings of the institutions themselves. And another, I think, important component of this OSCE toolkit is that it's really important, I think, as tonight is done in the two previous panels, that we strengthen partnerships with nonprofit organizations, civil society, academics who are working in this area, local governments, politicians, staffers, global organizations, addressing all forms of violence and harassment in the political sphere. And this includes things like amending existing legislation, criminalizing violence against all forms of violence, but against women in politics specifically. It includes reforming existing codes of conduct, which I would include as that set of rules of eliminating the use of non-disclosure agreements in politics, providing clear definitions, timelines, support mechanisms for survivors, and all of those issues that even when we have these codes of conduct in place, they are still insufficient to address this issue. I think it's also important that we situate these broader global discussions within the Canadian case specifically, and that we tie these debates into broader national and provincial agendas that are already ongoing that seek to tackle gender-based violence in society. We know that gender-based violence happens in politics because we live in a society that is deeply misogynistic, colonial, racist, homophobic, transphobic, and ableist. And so efforts to combat all forms of violence will also help address violence that is occurring in the political sphere. And I think as well, I know Rebecca maybe doesn't have as much hope about her chapter as maybe I do, but the calls to action that are included in her chapter, which she's co-authored with Cynthia Sturby, talks about the need to enact the 231 calls for justice in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Final Report, and to adopt the 94 calls to action in the TRC. And just one I would put on the table too, and then I'll sort of stop, is I heard more recently that LEAF is recommending to establish a gender-based violence accountability mechanism, or a commissioner, a GBV commissioner. And part of the mandate of this commissioner would be to use an intersectional definition of gender-based violence in their mandate that would be adopted from CEDAW. And to me, I think this is a really interesting and important recommendation that we should be thinking about. And just, I guess, finally, is I think, you know, it's also important to consider that the local context matters. You know, this is the important role being done by all the organizations that are on this call. And I really thank everyone who's participated in this for drawing attention to the fact that violence is happening in the political sphere. Because I think we haven't had these discussions yet between academics and civil society organizations, and it's really important. And for just something small for people who are here to do, if you're wondering, is, you know, support these groups, fund these groups, work with these groups if you don't have the financial means, and get on their mailing list and engage with the work that they're doing, because it's really, really so important. So I'll leave it there, and I encourage you to pick up the book and see what the other calls to action are in the chapters.
Great. Thank you so much, Tracy. And now I do want to take the time to thank our panelists. It has been so lovely being your moderator. It's been such an honor. And I want to pass it to Liz to close the panel.
Okay. Yes, it takes a second to unmute myself. Thank you very much, everyone. I realize we're past the time, but I just want to echo the comment in the chat from Casey that, you know, I think that this entire series is proof of what happens when women come together and decide that they want to tackle a subject that's important and that demands attention. So I'm always much like the other day when it was December 6th, I'm always a little sad to not see more men participating in these discussions, but I think maybe that's something that we can talk about if we continue to look at working on furthering this series along and making sure that we continue this dialogue. I just wanted to say thank you to Rebecca, Joanne, Dr. Lynn Jones, Katie, Elizabeth Smith, McCrossin, and Tracy Rainey for joining us this evening. I'm also acutely aware of, in addition to a lot of the labor that we do during the day, there's a lot of emotional and care labor that takes place that we are in sitting here, being here tonight, not spending time with friends and family or resting in the ways that we necessarily would like to. And that in itself is really indicative of the labor that we have to do in order to progress these movements forward. So just recognizing that and holding space for that for everyone this evening. Thank you for the conversation and the dialogue. I just wanted to let you know that we obviously have been really thrilled with the way that this has turned out. I mean, I came on board a little late, but I'm so glad that I did. We would love to continue doing more of this. We also have a survey that we'd like to provide you. I'm not sure if anyone can actually pop that into the chat, just in case. I'm not sure if we're doing it in the chat or if we're going to email it out after. I can't remember. Leah will email it to everybody. Okay, perfect. And I also wanted to let you know that we would love to continue this dialogue in 2025. So definitely provide us with more suggestions and ideas of what you'd like to see happen. I think, as mentioned by many of the speakers this evening, our power is in the collective and in gathering. And Dr. Lynn Jones, I just want to acknowledge and really appreciate as well everything that you've said about the intersections, as well as Rebecca around the intersections of race and gender. We certainly, as a white woman, cis white woman sitting here, there's a lot of privilege that we bring to the table and in these conversations around raising funds and raising money and around economics, et cetera. And I think it's really important that as white women, myself included, I'm going to try and find places and spaces where I can move my money to move power and invest and support women of color, Indigenous women in their efforts to run in politics and to be in these spaces. So just really great. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll look forward to continuing this dialogue. There's also some resources, Stacey, I'm not sure if you've already put it in the chat, just around some stuff that we can provide people around harassment in politics. And we'll look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. I'm going to stop talking so that we can all